well, they say all life came from the sea, you know, and I have to admit that coming from New Zealand, I've got a real affinity to the coast and to the oceans. Maybe it's my Pacific heritage. Initially, when we first came to Scotland 11 years ago or 12 years ago, we were inland, and I was a long way away from the coast. And I missed New Zealand. I was homesick. When I came up here, you know, it was just that thought of that. If I'm standing up to my ankles in the oceans here on the other side of the world, then actually I am connected to New Zealand still, because all the oceans are connected and everything's connected. Scotland's surrounded by a kelp forest. So we're right amongst the Laminaria digitata here. So this is this seaweed this is the one we eat a lot of. Now that's all part of a huge kelp forest that, you know, part of the job is that it protects the coastline. It's the first defense for the waves. It's a nursery. You got all the fish and crabs and lobsters. They all breed and feed in there. So what brought me to this area particularly was I got offered a seaweed harvest manager's job. And we were a commercial operation. 4 of us, hand cutting, would cut a ton a day of this particular seaweed. Over the space of 6 months, we hand harvested 47 tonne of seaweed. But machine harvesters in one day can do 40 tonne in a day. So you can see the difference between hand harvesting and machine harvesting. Quite a big difference. It's a slightly different kelp that they're harvesting, but 40 tonne in a day over 6 months, how much is that? That's a lot. You know, for myself, it just feels like it's way too much. The way that this particular seaweed sporulates or drops its spores, its seed, is from the blades, from the leaves. So by leaving that amount on there, that's still leaving plenty of organic matter there to drop the seed. So no, it's pretty sustainable. What some of the harvesters were doing were, were cutting them here, and all you're leaving is a stipe. You're not leaving anything to drop spores. There's nothing left of it. You know, if you leave this certain amount, that can still drop millions of spores from there.
So from these soils, we're going to measure the carbon content of the soil, and we're also interested in looking here at the living biomass from the plants that grow on the marsh surface to understand how that biomass from the roots is contributing to the soil itself. So what we have here is a peat, and this is peat that's growing as the marsh plants grow. They trap carbon. Some of this is dead material, some of this is live root material. And then this builds up over what was once a mudflat. So we go from the mudflat into a salt marsh environment, and these build up over time and accumulate carbon. Some of our work would be to take samples at different depths, and we'll measure the carbon in the soil. We'll also take these samples and use radiometric dating techniques. So for example, we know that there are radioisotopes from nuclear reactors, that Chernobyl, for example, and we would expect to see a spike in this 137 cesium radioisotope at a particular depth. And that is then a time marker that helps us understand the rate at which the soil is accumulating. Now this is really important for us. We can measure the carbon, and that gives us the stock of carbon in the soil. But to really understand the burial rate, so if you like, the context for carbon sequestration from the atmosphere, we really need to understand the rate at which this material is being buried. And this site here at Skinflats on the Forth Estuary has one of Scotland's highest burial rates. We know that because we've previously worked here, we've dated these cores. The plants grow upwards, so it's essentially what happens as the mud comes in on a high tide, sort of cloudy water. These plants act as a baffle, and they trap the sediment, and it settles around their roots, and then the plants just keep growing up. So it's wonderful, actually. These places, as sea level rises, as long as we give them space, they'll grow with sea level rise, and they'll certainly grow in places like this because there's plenty of sediment supply for them to keep growing. So actually, what we need to do in places like this is think about where the coastline is and allow the coastline to shift inland to let these places keep up with sea level rise. If we don't, we're going to create a situation of coastal squeeze, and eventually we'll lose these habitats because they've nowhere to go.